Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. My name is Alexandra Gouta. I'm a journalist and I will be the moderator of this next session of the Delphi Economic Forum. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Olivier de Schutter. Mr. de Schutter is a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights since May last year. Over the next 15 minutes, we will discuss about the global financing of social protection, a topic more relevant than ever due to the coronavirus pandemic. The numbers are not good. It is estimated that almost 55% of the global population does not have any access to any form of social protection. And it's about 4 billion people, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. De Schutter. It's a big number of people. So the pandemic will probably make things worse for hundreds of millions of people. So in this context, the creation of a global fund that could help low-income countries develop a capacity, a long-term capacity to finance their social protection programs would be necessary and critical. The creation of such a fund has been discussed and proposed by social experts for years now, but I believe that amid the COVID-19 crisis, it gathers strong support, significant support. Nevertheless, I don't know how easy it will be during these times of economic hardship. So, with these few words, I would like to pass the screen actually, to you, Mr. De Sutter, and ask you, how close are we really to the creation of such a fund? When do you expect it to be set up? And what funding sources are explored?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Gupta. Very great pleasure to be with you. And you are quite right that the pandemic crisis has shown how we must strengthen social resilience in many countries. In total, we have some 55% of the world's population that is not covered at all by any form of social protection. And the crisis has shown that those most affected are people in the informal sector of the economy, are people in non-standard forms of employment, are people who are already vulnerable in normal times, but in times of crisis, as the companies close down and as job opportunities are disappearing, these are particularly impacted. And many countries simply do not have the safety nets that allow them to protect their populations. So this is why this idea of a global fund for social protection has come up. The key contribution of this fund would be to provide predictable financing to countries so that they can commit to protect their population by providing rights-based social protection schemes. Rights-based social protection schemes mean that governments commit to provide support to people, starting with child allowances and maternity benefits, ending with old age pension, and including unemployment benefits, disability benefits, sickness benefits. In other terms, protecting people from cradle to grave throughout their lives with some basic income security. To do this, governments need to be secured about funding. They need to be certain that they will be able to continue to finance these social protection guarantees, and that is what this global fund should provide. Now, we led since many months consultations around this issue with very strong support from some governments. I'd like to particularly applaud the role that France has been playing in the G7 and the G20 in this regard. And there is lots of appetite for creating a new international financial mechanism supporting low-income countries to establish social protection floors. Many actors whom I consulted with have expressed a concern that this fund would be duplicating existing things, would perhaps be competing with other initiatives. And so the proposals I'm making are really building on what is already existing, ensuring that the existing mechanisms will be better financed, better supported, and that the existing actors already involved in strengthening social protection in the Global South will have greater support for the role they already play. So the idea is not to remove what has been done until now, which is still very insufficient, and to replace it by something different. The idea is to build on what has already been done and to give those actors, particularly the International Labour Organization and the World Bank, a role in organizing this support to low-income countries. And I would like to add one last thing, which is that we saw from the pandemic that in many cases, the financing of social protection may be unpredictable because of the crisis that develop. It can be an economic crisis, as we saw in 2009, 2012. It can be an epidemic, a pandemic, as we see now. It could be in the future climatic crisis leading to natural disasters. And we need countries to be insured against the risk that the social protection floors they set up for their populations will not be impossible to fund. And we need, therefore, to provide them with this predictable support that the Global Fund will be able to provide. And that is the hope we have, that it will trigger efforts in the Global South to significantly improve social protection of the population.
Mm-hmm. So, what are the next steps for the creation of this fund, and how possible is it that we'll see it being set up during 2022, for example?
Well, there are two major developments in the next few months. One is that in the Human Rights Council, I will be presenting a sort of update report informing governments about the state of play of the discussions around this global fund. And I very much hope that following that presentation, the Human Rights Council will encourage the actors involved, particularly the ILO and the World Bank, to make operational proposals in order to set up this new mechanism. Secondly, we have, of course, the G20 under Italian presidency that will close at the end of 2021. And it is my hope that a very strong signal will be given by the G20 in order to ensure that this global fund will be set up. It is not necessary for the G20 to give a mandate to the ILO and to the World Bank to work on this, but it would be, of course, a very welcome gesture of support. I should also note that in the month of June, there will be an important meeting within the International Labour Organization, the International Labour Conference that convenes every year, and the Global Fund will also be discussed in this context. In other terms, there are many fora in which this idea is discussed, and I hope that the German presidency of the G7 in 2022 will be able to confirm the establishment of this new mechanism. And I mention this because 2022 is the 10th anniversary of a very important recommendation adopted within the International Labour Organization, the recommendation number 202 on social protection floors. And so it would be a very nice thing if on the 10th anniversary of this recommendation, governments could say, we are now going to deliver on our pledges, we are now going to respect our promises made back in 2012.
Mm-hmm. In what organization could this fund be financially linked to? You already mentioned the World Bank, for example. I don't know if, or the ILO. I don't know if there are any other mechanisms and organization with which the financial part of this fund could be linked.
Well, we have quite some bilateral and multilateral support for development, of course. Only a very small fraction of existing official development assistance, however, goes to social protection. Most goes to health, to education, and to short-term projects, but financing countries so that they provide unemployment benefits, old age pension, maternity benefits, disability allowances, for example, that is something that is not often done. And so the idea is that the existing resources from official development assistance should be increased in order to finance social protection floors. And this increase is perfectly realistic in financial terms. Let me give just one figure. The ILO has calculated that in order to allow low-income countries, in other terms, the 78 poorest countries on earth, to provide a full range of social protection floors to their populations, the financing gap is 78 billion US dollars. Now, 78 billion US dollars per year is not a huge sum. It is huge for those poor countries, but for rich countries, it is perfectly affordable. It's about half the existing amount we already give to official development assistance. In other terms, my hope is that if we establish this global fund, rich countries will be encouraged to provide more support to social protection floors, and poor countries in turn will be encouraged to protect their populations much better by this financial support that they receive. And so it is something that can be found, this money, it is something that is affordable, especially if we think that social protection is an investment in the future. It is a condition for inclusive and sustainable growth. It is a way to increase the future growth prospects of the economy. It is not simply a cost on the economy of the countries concerned. And so it is a way for these countries to prepare the future of their populations. Now, I hope that the ILO and the World Bank will play their role in this regard. The ILO has a number of projects in developing countries in which they provide technical assistance to countries wishing to strengthen social protection floors. The ILO, for example, organizes assessment-based national dialogues in a number of countries, which are consultative events where civil society, government, academics work on establishing social protection floors. And these assessment-based national dialogues could be developed in the future in the countries receiving support from the international community to finance social protection. That would be the condition. Countries would be supported if they commit to organize such national consultations, such assessment-based national dialogues, and they would be provided finance based on the realistic presentation of plans to establish social protection in those countries.
So you already mentioned the figure about the financial gap of the low-income countries. I don't know if you have estimated what would be the critical mass of funds the financial facility of this fund would need to mobilize in order to work properly.
Well, when we mention this figure of 78 billion US dollars per year, this corresponds to the financing gap for low-income countries. In other terms, the gap between what they already have invested in social protection now and what they would need to invest for all the population to be covered. However, for all the population to be covered, you need to strengthen social registries. All the population has to be registered. You need to have a better capacity for the national administration to cover the population and to deliver the funds to families, to workers, etc. You need to encourage informal workers to be registered and to claim benefits as a result of being registered. So it takes time to cover the full range of the population. And so as a result, the Global Fund would start with a relatively smaller sum and then would grow as capacity to use the funding would increase within the countries concerned. And the ILO and myself, we have been working on these scenarios in which essentially the Global Fund would start small, maybe with 41, 42 billion dollars per year, and then would gradually grow. But at the same time, countries benefiting from the fund would invest by mobilizing from domestic resources, and gradually the domestic resources would complement and would grow, and international support would decrease gradually over the next 7 or 10 years. So basically the idea is that international support would allow a process to be started, but this process would gradually be funded by the countries concerned themselves, mobilizing domestic resources. So gradually the support of the international community could be less important with time. And in the end, after 10, 12 years, perhaps it could become unnecessary. And so the idea is not that taxpayers from which countries support ad infinitum social protection in the Global South. The idea is that we encourage countries in the Global South to put social protection at the top of their political priorities by providing them with the minimum support they need to kickstart this process.
Mm-hmm. There is much discussion these days about the role that the SDRs, the special drawing rights, could play in closing financial gaps and creating money. What how could they help in this cause, in the creation of this fund? The SDRs, I mean.
Yeah, indeed, you're absolutely right, Alexandra, to mention this. In fact, the ministers of finance of the G20 in April decided that the special drawing rights, which is essentially a tool that the IMF uses to provide liquidity facilities for countries, should be increased by an amount equivalent to $650 billion. And this is important because it provides some fiscal space to poor countries, allowing them to manage better the financing of their debt and to overcome the deficit problems that they experience as a result of the crisis. We could do more of this. It's certainly one way to give some oxygen to the countries concerned, but we must go beyond the commitments already made within the G20. It is indeed one useful tool the IMF can use to provide support to these countries.
Thank you. So another question is the following. It seems that we have entered an era, a global era of black swans and many possible future shocks, not only a future pandemic maybe, but also natural disasters. How could this fund help low-income countries become more resilient in general?
Indeed, I think this is a question that you just asked, because one reason why poor countries do not invest in social protection and do not guarantees to their population is because they fear that they will not be able to finance this if they're hit by a crisis. If suddenly, for example, the export revenues go down, if the bills of imports go up, if they are hit by natural disasters or indeed by a new pandemic. And so we need to provide these countries with a sort of insurance that if they are hit by a crisis, they will be supported because the international community will increase its level of support in times of crisis. This is why the Global Fund is not simply conceived as a tool to provide financing that is predictable year after year, which is already very important. It also is an instrument that will commit to increase the level of support up to a certain point if the countries are suddenly hit by an unpredictable crisis that makes it more difficult for them to finance social protection. Because we should realize that in many small, poor countries, the economy is very poorly diversified. So very often you will see situations where the costs of social protection will increase because much of the population is hit by natural disasters, for example, at the same time that the revenues from the state will decrease because, for example, the harvests have been too poor or because the price of the commodities that the country sells on international markets has gone down. And so we need to support countries against those shocks by telling them, if you experience such a shock, you will be supported and our level of support from the international community will increase. For the moment, countries do not have this kind of security. They depend on official development assistance, but that assistance is unpredictable. It changes year after year, and countries do not dare to commit to social protection floors for their population because they are not certain that they will be able to fund year after year these commitments to the population.
The poverty and lack of adequate social protection seem to be unacceptably persistent, though there are many mechanisms that help low-income countries address these issues. So my question is, what have we been doing wrong? This is the first question. And the second, are you optimistic that this fund could indeed make a difference?
Well, I think we have been really reacting crisis after crisis to the needs of poor countries by improvised solutions, very much ad hoc. And the governments concerned in poor countries have very often tried to react by providing cash transfers to the populations in times of crisis. We've seen this in the current crisis. Many new social programs have been designed, but they were improvised, they were ad hoc, and they were not standing rights-based social protection schemes. This, in other terms, is a bit like governments trying to recruit firefighters when the fire breaks out, rather than having a standing preparedness against fires in order to be able to react immediately if a fire starts. And so we need, I think, to change our approach, to be much more preventative in our approach, to plan for the worst, and to be prepared for the next crisis by building social resilience, rather than having to improvise solutions, either by cash transfer schemes as have been developed during the last crisis, or by providing ad hoc international support to countries facing crisis. And what will change with the Global Fund is this predictability. It will be possible for beneficiary countries to know that for the next 10 or 12 years, they will be able to count on a certain level of support from the Global Fund, and they will therefore be allowed to invest in social protection and to put at the top of their political priorities the protection of their populations, because they will know that this will be funded with support from the international community, and that even if a crisis strikes them, they will be insured against that risk.
So one last question, Mr. De Schutter. I would like to ask you the following. Nowadays, there is excessive fear of unemployment and poverty all over the planet, even in developed countries. The people in many developed countries would probably feel that they will need more social protection after the crisis. So, do you believe that developed countries will be able to support the work of this fund and at the same time support the social needs of their population?
Well, I think you are absolutely right that the crisis hits all countries. Paradoxically, however, although rich economies have seen a significant decrease of their GDP in 2020, it is nevertheless in poor countries that the impact shall be the worst in the next few years. And that is because these countries are very often poorly diversified, and their main source of revenue is the exports to the rich countries of raw materials. But these exports have been going down as a result of the pandemic. Moreover, many of these countries depend on remittances from migrant workers that have gone down by some 20% as a result of the crisis. And especially these poor countries have no margin to support their population. They cannot borrow on international markets easily because the level of debt they experience is already very high, and they cannot afford to increase their debt further. So these countries find it extremely difficult to cope with the current crisis. But I agree with you that the crisis is everywhere, and that poverty and unemployment will increase to some extent also, of course, also in rich countries. So why would we nevertheless want to support poor countries' efforts in building social protection? Well, the reason is very simple. We are interdependent in this globalized world. And for example, I know many businesses that fear that their supply chains, when they source materials or products from the global south, are threatened as a result of this crisis, because the workers will, losing their employment, may not return to work easily, because the populations that will buy our exports will not have a purchasing power that is sufficient for them to buy what we produce. In other terms, we need to support poor countries because in this global economy, we depend on them for our production, and we depend on them for our exports to have markets on which we expand. And I think it's impossible to think about the global economy today without thinking about this interdependence between countries.
Generally, the world is connected. So I would like to thank you very much, Mr. De Schutter, for being brief and to the point. It sounds that we are closer to the creation of a global fund for social protection than we were a few years ago. So I believe that we'll see many things in this field in the near future. Thank you very much.